Well, what I want to start off with saying is that droughts are a test. And as a professor, I know the value of tests. And I know how much students learn without tests, and I know how much agencies learn without tests. So we have tests for water systems, and they're called droughts and floods and lawsuits. Throughout history, you can look at the history of California's water as a history of droughts. And we've really made the best of these opportunities over time, going back into even the 1800s and the early 1900s. Large and small improvements have been made, as the previous panel has discussed, with this drought. So we're continuing in that fine tradition of using a good crisis to good advantage. At the same time, just like Heraclitus said, you cannot cross the same river twice. You can't experience the same drought twice. And I think Mike Anderson's talk really highlighted that we might see the similar kind of hydrologic conditions that we might have seen in some past year, but we're going to experience it differently because the structure of economy is different, our expectations as a society are different, their populations are different, all kinds of things. For this particular drought, let me sort of review the impacts of this 2014 drought on cities and agriculture. This is the worst year of the current drought. This drought was experienced very differently in different parts of the system. We're a very large state, and it's quite variable, even though the entire state was in drought. The large urban areas suffered relatively little from this drought. Really, it was only Santa Cruz that had major cutbacks as a large urban area. We were very worried about the Sacramento area up until about February of this last year. But after that, we got lucky. Why was the urban areas really spared from this 8th driest year of record? It was largely because of good preparation. After the 1988 to 92 drought, a lot of the cities did a lot of water conservation. They diversified their water sources, did a lot more conjunctive use, water storage, water market activity, lots of things. So we're already seeing the benefits of previous droughts in this drought. And if this drought continues for another year or two, the urban areas are going to be driven up to another level, and some of the things we've talked about will become much easier. Because the urban areas were not really so badly affected, there wasn't a lot of urgency for the local agencies on the urban side to push a lot of conservation. So their conservation this year was relatively modest. They don't want to be accused of crying wolf, I expect. The shortages, and there were some pretty bad shortages, were mostly with very small rural communities that have a single source, particularly groundwater, where their wells were going dry. This highlights really a perennial problem we're going to have and always have had with small systems, and an area where we need to focus and pay more attention. Agriculture really was I think the biggest economic hit in this drought this last year. They suffered from a 25% loss of total water supply. To me, that's a lot of water. This was the biggest loss of water to agriculture that they have ever seen, in history. Most of this reduction in surface water supply was made up by groundwater pumping. Maybe 75% of that loss was made up by groundwater pumping. And I think that really brought home to everybody, including a lot of folks in agriculture, how important maintaining groundwater is and how important managing it is in order to have resiliency for droughts. This shortage in agriculture, there still was 1.5 million acre-foot roughly left, was about 5% of cropland fell at about $2 billion in costs, and I only have 2 minutes left, so I better talk really fast. This drought's not yet over. We still have probably on the order of 18 million acre-foot of accumulated storage deficit. This is about the same as the consumptive use of agriculture for a year. So we have a pretty big deficit just from this last drought. What should we do better looking forward? First, and I think the overarching comment is that California is going to be, water is scarce in California, and we need to manage it, account for it, administer it, and manage it more tightly. Just like in New York City, land is very scarce. You manage property rights to land very, very tightly. We're going to get closer to that, I think, on the water side. Both agriculture and urban sectors are going to benefit a lot from the state's ability to have water markets be effective, more flexible, more timely. We've had some problems with that. Agricultural overall, at least in the long term, is going to benefit from implementing the groundwater reforms in a shorter rather than a longer period of time, sooner rather than later. Particularly the permanent crops that are now a third of agriculture in California. They really need that in order to maintain their profits and their economic solvency, I imagine. Urban agencies need to structure their groundwater, their pricing to encourage conservation while remaining solvent. That's a challenge, particularly given Proposition 218. There'll be, I think, some advantages that folks will see on doing this drought pricing in advance. So it complies more easily with 218 and also gives people more advance warning. This drought that Mike Anderson so aptly presented, I think we really need to think of this as not the once every couple of career kind of drought. You know, worst since 76, 77, which is really an extra career ago for most people. We have to look forward to this as being the kind of drought we're going to see once or twice or maybe 3 times in the course of an average professional career. And I think that really changes the way we think about it with agencies. For the small, vulnerable communities, I think this is a special challenge, and the counties, particularly the county health officials, I think really probably ought to get ahead on doing preparations for these kind of events in the future. And I think one of the things we see in floods and in earthquakes, other kinds of catastrophes, is we have drills, drought drills, flood drills. Well, one of the things we've been talking about and proposing is what we call dry runs. Practice droughts in order to get the agencies thinking about droughts, to get the agency and regulator cooperation down. That, I think, really cost us several months in this last year. And so we need to practice because it's going to happen a lot more frequent than it has in the past. So that's the end of my remarks. Thank you very much. Get on to the panel.
Thank you, Jay. And so now we have a panel that is going to kind of tee off of those remarks. We tried to bring a mix of folks who are operating in the trenches in different parts of the system. So I'm going to start down here with introducing Susan Mulligan, who is the general manager of Calleguas Water District, which is down in Ventura County, a wholesale agency and a member of the Metropolitan Water District family. Then we've got Joe McIlvaine, who is president of Paramount Farms. Southern San Joaquin Valley is an agricultural powerhouse. Paramount within the Southern San Joaquin Valley is a well-known powerhouse. Jay mentioned the permanent cropping issues. You guys are big in that. And also you're in an area that has a lot of groundwater issues. Martha Guzman-Aceves is in the Horseshoe. Has been one of the key people on the governor's team working on water policy more generally and also on responding to the drought and all of the different kinds of things that the governor's office has been aiming to coordinate and spearhead. And then Andrew Folland is with the California Water Foundation, which has been an important player in looking at groundwater management and groundwater reform, among other things. I'll just highlight that one as a big example from this past year. So you can see they all kind of come from different angles of this. They've all had their sleeves rolled up this year and probably have not had a chance. I don't know if I hope you had a good holiday break because you got to get the sleeves rolled back up again. But I wanted to sort of start with asking each of the panelists your reactions to Jay's remarks, both about sort of what went down this past year, but also the kind of priorities that he outlined looking ahead. And I think he had at least one in there for each of you. So maybe we'll start down at your end, Susan, with your thoughts.
Sure. As you mentioned, Calleguas is a large urban water wholesale agency north of Los Angeles. We deliver about 110,000 acre-feet a year to 20 retail water agencies and a population of about 630,000. The retail water agencies who buy water from us are a diverse mix. They're cities, they're county water districts, they're investor-owned utilities, and small mutual water companies that have limited resources. So it's quite a mix. 75% of our demands are met by imported supplies. Almost all of that is state project. We have very little access to the Colorado River system, so we've been quite nervous this past year as we've seen reservoir levels drop. We've had about an 18-month buffer from drought as compared to, say, the Central Valley because of Metropolitan's investment in storage and local investments in local supplies. But without significant rain, we're going to deplete that storage this year, and we're probably a few months away from having very serious cutbacks with significant financial penalties. From our view, the supply shortage is part of a recurring cycle, and it's the result of two trends. It's clear that our existing surface water project operations that take water from rivers, put them in lakes, conflict with ecosystem needs, and that wasn't known when they were built. That's resulted in more stringent regulation designed to leave more water in the natural waterways, so less comes our direction. And combining that with the fact that over the last few decades, the population in California and Nevada and Arizona, and we all compete for the same water resources, those have all grown. So we are chasing after less water, and there are more of us chasing after that less water. So although we've invested heavily in recycled water, brackish groundwater treatment, turf replacement, water efficiency education, fixture rebates, these have not supplied and conserved enough water to keep up with the lower supplies and the higher demand from population. The challenges we're facing in this particular drought are that many water users are complacent, especially those who can pay a lot for water. They're not using water efficiently, and they're not likely to. It's a social justice problem, really, and it is unfair to those people who are doing their part to conserve water. It's also impossible, and in the best case, extremely difficult and time-consuming, for water agencies like ours to get approval for projects that we need because we have the water demands, and we're going to keep having shortages if we don't have those projects. And examples are projects like tunnels under the delta, ocean desalination. As long as people are using water for landscaping, that always gets brought up when one of those projects is approved. All that turf in your area, and we have some wealthy people in our area, you're wasting the water. So that's a challenge. And as a wholesale water supplier, we have very limited authority to regulate the use of water. And this mix of retail water agencies who buy from us really are reluctant to truly regulate outdoor water use or implement effective tiered water rates. They're afraid of political repercussions, litigation. They don't want to be the only ones conserving water. It's kind of a tragedy of the commons. If I conserve water, why shouldn't other people do it? So these are challenges for us, and that's kind of a background for responding what Jay had to say. I definitely agree that we need to improve our pricing structures on the urban level and have tiered pricing. But I don't think it's going to happen at the local level. I think we need help from the state to do it. What happens is local homeowners with big lots show up at city council meetings and say, "You're making me pay too much water for my lawns." And then they soften the tiers and they don't do it. And investor-owned utilities with a for-profit motive really would like to sell water. So the mutuals have not as much sophistication, and it's harder for them. And some are afraid of litigation. We talked about this at a recent meeting amongst our customers, and one of them said, "I heard another agency got sued because their tiered rate structure didn't match their cost structure. And there are some laws that say that what you charge for water has to be commensurate with the costs." So we need some help at a higher level for these things. And I would add to the sort of request for regulatory help, actions to reduce the square footage of turf. It's true, and one of the senators up here said it earlier, if we're going to add population and if we're going to get away from these kinds of cyclical shortages, urban folks probably can't have the landscaping that we have. We need to change the culture. I was speaking with a woman from Australia last night, and it was considered bad to have a green lawn during their drought. That certainly isn't the case yet in California. And we could use some help from that. There's a model water efficiency ordinance that local governments are supposed to adopt. The problem is it's got a lot of loopholes, and it's a state law, It's got a lot of loopholes for sizes of things. The efficiency calculation isn't that tight, and frankly, homes are getting put in with a lot of turf. And one thing that could be done is that could be tightened up. And I would ask that that be tightened up and perhaps turf be limited to a certain square footage on properties, and tiered pricing be mandated so that the cities can be protected from litigation and protected from their constituents who say, don't do that.
Thank you. Joe.
So, it's very interesting trying to solve the state's water problems in half a day. As an agricultural user of water, I feel a little like a fish out of water here in this environment. I think there are a couple of points I think that are worthwhile making. Agriculture has a great capacity to use water. So historically, whatever water has been available has been put to beneficial use by agriculture. That's what happens. And we will continue to do that. Agriculture will use the amount of water that is available to it to farm land productively, to provide jobs in places like the Central Valley where there aren't a great many industries that provide jobs. There's much more property available, much more land available for farming in California than there is water to farm it. I often hear people talking, for example, why should we be growing almonds in California and shipping them around the world? And it used to be, it didn't used to be difficult to explain to people. People used to understand the value of international trade and that you actually had to sell something in order to be able to buy something. If California is not a great place to grow beef, we can trade almonds for beef, and that'll be good for the state. Agriculture today is feeling a little embattled, I think, particularly in the circumstances we find ourselves in this current drought. But we're not bad guys. We haven't done anything wrong. We've taken the resources available to us and we've put them to beneficial use. We've provided jobs for families and communities up and down the state. I think we've done generally a good job. And the last drought we had was 87 to 91, culminated with a zero allocation on the state project. And at that point, I think agriculture in the Central Valley, at least where I farm, woke up to the fact that water for the rest of our foreseeable future was going to be the limiting resource. And we took a number of actions to address that situation. First of all, we recognized that in order to pay for an increasingly scarce water supply, we were going to have to farm more valuable crops. Today in Kern County, you'll be hard-pressed to find an acre of cotton. There's a little cotton there, but it's only by guys that really want to grow cotton. You don't find too many people doing that. What you found is that the entire agricultural economy in the San Joaquin Valley has transformed itself into a system that is growing the highest possible value crops. And that is primarily in response to the value of water. That is a recognition of the value of water. We really can't, and I think that's going to continue. For example, you'll see dairies replaced by other crops. Simply because you can't afford to grow forage if you're going to be paying what one gentleman mentioned as the true cost of water. Secondly, we instituted a massive effort at researching the most efficient ways to use water in the crops that we're growing. There's been an absolute transformation in irrigation practices in California. in operations, at least in the southern part of the valley that I'm familiar with, water efficiencies in excess of 95% in terms of uniformity of distribution are now commonplace. And in fact, you'd be foolish to be operating at less than 90% efficiency. Finally, this whole concept of groundwater management has really come to the fore. You know, when we built the State Water Project, it was in large part in response, people don't remember this, but in fact, I'm old enough, I remember it, that it was in large part in response to the overdraft situation in the San Joaquin Valley. And in fact, the initiation of water deliveries through the State Water Project eliminated the overdraft in Kern County for many years. That actually addressed that overdraft situation. Now the reliability of the supply on that system is hovering somewhere around 50%. And at those levels of delivery, of course, we're no longer sustaining a balanced groundwater supply. That's certainly going to have to be addressed. And I don't think you'll find a farmer, well, you might find a few, that says you don't have to address the groundwater issue. People are lowering their wells. I think there's general recognition that we're going to have to address that. How it happens is going to be the most disruptive economic upheaval ever to occur in the agricultural community in the San Joaquin Valley. How that, and the other places as well, I'm just not familiar with all the basins, but just consider this, the least expensive water supply right now is groundwater. It's free. All you have to do is put a well down and pump it out. It is going to be the scarcest water supply in the future. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. And if you think about that, if you think about the people, the farmers that are relying on that groundwater for their supply today, what's going to happen when they're limited to the safe yield of the basin? Gene Fuller mentioned earlier, how we get there is a real issue. We're grappling with that on a local basis. Yet the last thing I want to say, I don't mean to take up too much time, but the last thing I want to say is that, localized resources are fine. There's no question about that. But Kern County as a localized resource is a desert. And that's okay. We can go back to being a desert. But I think, if you think about a localized high-speed rail, for example, I'm not sure how it works. Some systems are not localized, and the California state water system is not a localized system. It is a statewide system. And to make maximum use of the water in California, whether it's for environmental or economic purposes, requires that we look at it as a big, complex system, not a localized system. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Martha, view from the horseshoe.
Yeah, let me just jump off a couple of thoughts from what was just said. And I think we definitely saw some of these kind of social issues in the allocation of water this year, not just in the urban sector where there were, particularly in areas like Santa Barbara and Ventura County, with wealthier purchases of water even outside of their retail agencies, but just direct purchases of like tanked water for their landscaping. Mm-hmm. That is a dynamic, but even within agriculture, it's a dynamic that we are going to see even tighter, because if we just use market-based mechanisms for purchasing water for the most beneficial use within agriculture, we're not necessarily putting parameters around that, like, well, let's choose it to the crop that produces the most jobs, or let's place it in the crop where there's more potential for groundwater recharge. Or we don't really have a system, a social infrastructure system, even around the limited market system that we have. So it is something that will likely happen on its own, but even, I just wanted to stress that even within agriculture, there's a lot of impacts that could happen, let's say, on the west side of the valley, if some of the limited water goes to almonds versus tomatoes for processing, versus some of the limited cotton. There's a lot of dynamics there that should we be questioning some of those allocations at the micro and regional or local level? It does have an impact in our economies, in our regional economies. And sometimes, certainly not at the state level, we don't make the best decisions, but sometimes at the local level, we're not even inherently focused to make the best decisions economically for the local communities. So I think there's a lot of sub-questions within water allocation, particularly in agriculture. I also think that it is a regional economy question. I think we are an export-based agricultural economy. We employ some years up to 1 of every 10 workers in agricultural sector, whether it's production or transportation. So it's a big part of our economy. And you know, this notion that I do just want to keep it there because it is about jobs and it's not so much about price of food and food availability in the state, which I think is an easy argument to get into, that we need to keep, you know, producing, you know, hundreds of thousands of tomatoes for process in the state of California because we need to eat, is not accurate. We may need those for jobs in the Central Valley where there's not a lot of diversification of the economy, and that is a really valid discussion. But let's keep it a real discussion. There's a lot of value in agriculture, huge employer, huge part of the economy. So those are all really good little factoids to keep as we discuss water allocation. And then just a couple tidbits from what I was able to see in some of the amazing work that a lot of the water agencies did in the drought task force. As you know, the governor called together a drought task force with many state agencies, and just, you know, the microcosm of these small rural communities that have some overlap with the traditional communities that have lacked infrastructure and attention. But these communities are more foothill-like communities. There's a lot of media around East Porterville in Tulare County. It's a great example of how much more strategic infrastructure and consolidation we need in the state just by looking at these small communities. East Porterville was one, but also Willits was another, and even more recently looking at the city of Healdsburg as an example, where because traditionally we haven't done cost-benefit analysis we have done it looking at averages and not at these extreme levels. A small town like Willits has never thought it made economic sense to have, you know, 2 years of storage put up in Willits because it's usually wet, you know, like 80% of the time in Willits. And those are the types of things that they are now having to do, and part of some of the OES funding that they got required them to do. Similarly in East Porterville, where, you know, again, a foothill community, and that one was particularly historic land use showed a lot of evidence of what we allowed to happen in the state, where I think it was in I'm going to get but you'll get the sense. It was like in a 25-acre radius, there was like over 200 wells, and the majority of them were very shallow. They were like between 30 and 50 feet. So, of course, they're not going to have enough water supply. So it's just another example of certainly some of the legacy issues that we're dealing with, and those are just little microcosms of what we need to do at a much bigger level, dealing with much harder issues like, well, maybe we can require storage in these small, you know, 500 acre feet a year to maybe 1,500 acre feet a year communities where we don't necessarily get into a lot of the difficulties around fishery needs and a lot of other habitat needs. But once we start getting to scale on dealing with more storage to be a little more resilient, we get to really difficult environmental questions and social questions about what our priorities are. So I think that will be a big challenge. It will be a big challenge for the California Water Commission and how they delegate some of the storage funding. And they will be looking at drought resilience and climate resilience into the future for sure. I think that one other thing I wanted to mention certainly is the governor is very much, you know, making climate a priority and making sure that not only are we resilient in managing our water, but a lot of the regional supplies and certainly statewide supplies that require a lot of electricity. In our new infrastructure, as we head into creating more, whether it's reclamation, recycling, whatever it is, flood preparedness. Oh, by the way, that's the example of Higglesworth, which I thought was ironic, is that, they, within a 4-month span, were going from, getting expedited orders from the water and regional water boards on recycling water and being a little innovative on the recycled use of that water, to dealing with a rush of flood water. And so they had, it's a perfect example of the extremes that even just this size of a community needs to be dealing with. But the power that is going to be needed, even in thinking of, let's say, what folks are really focused on now, which is the regional and reclamation recycled water, even desalinization. The big part that is an opportunity is for us to make that generation of electricity, which is often a big piece of the environmental harm from some of these projects, making it, greener. Some of it could be combusted with its own, as we know, some of the wastewater facilities can generate their own electricity. But it's a component that we should look at as we head into a future where we will need a lot more, whether it's pumping deeper and more to recycling more water. We need to make sure that new energy use is green. So let's keep that in mind. And then obviously we'll be talking, I'm sure, about groundwater management. And it is the groundwater management package that Senator Pavley and Assemblymember Dickinson led the effort on, is surface water and groundwater management. I mean, it really is not really the groundwater management of the past. It is really trying to get the accounting of both. It's that safe yield dynamic. And we will, I think the question came up, I think the governor committed in his signing message to look at the issue of streamlining adjudication. And there's quite a diverse perspective on what that means. So we'll be working with anyone who's interested in working with us on that. And finally, the issue of 218 has come up as well. And I think it's an issue both in terms of local financing, ability to deal with more conservation, as was a huge priority, is in our California Water Action Plan, is another area that we really need to tread a little more lightly because of the dynamics of making sure the voters have enough information and making sure all voters have enough information on that. So it is another area that we will commit to continue working on, and will take a much more massive effort than just a legislative effort.
Thank you. Cleanup.
Cleanup. I think a lot of my reactions to Jay's remarks have already been touched upon. I'll just be brief and reflect a little bit on Australia. I've had the opportunity to travel there a couple of times in the last 2 years. Was there most recently with a delegation of folks from throughout California, decision makers, particularly weighted towards Southern California. And I think that one of the things that I come away from that trip wanting to share is just sort of the art of the possible. I think what's striking about Australia is, of course, we have a very similar culture, very similar quality of life, similar sets of values, etc., similar economy, and they're doing things there that I think we maybe talk about, hope to achieve here in California, and I think would benefit us tremendously. And I think it's just simply important for us as we try to move in that direction to just simply understand that it can be done. And so just a couple of examples of that. And I think, a lot was made in the earlier panel of the bond as being an important down payment. I think it's also important to think of it as a catalyst, and that it has the opportunity to catalyze investment in new directions and in new areas that build upon the success of the past system that has benefited us so greatly, and that also maybe helps to overcome some of the limitations of that system that may have existed from the start, but also have continued to manifest and grow over time. I think, just kind of running down a quick list of a few of the things that I saw, I think the goal setting and planning that's undertaken in Australia is something to really look to and emulate in many respects. And I'm sure that Jane will correct any and all overstatements or misconceptions that I may be making here, but these are the impressions of at least one person having traveled there. But I think the goals and goal setting and planning is really done well there. And sure, we set goals and we have plans, and I actually think the Governor's Water Action Plan in particular is a really important comprehensive framework. But I think that setting targets and then actually managing to those targets is something that sounds really simple, but it's something that we just need to hold ourselves more accountable in those ways. I also think that I saw some really tremendous and interesting efforts to test and experiment with new technologies. I'm sure there's a lot of trial and error there. There is almost a sense that, and again, perhaps this is overstating, but I think there's a willingness to try and fail and try again with things. And so I think we have to be willing to actually experiment and be willing to try and innovate and fail. And I don't think actually our water managers have grown up in an environment in which that's really permitted or even rewarded. And yet, how do you advance as an industry if you don't actually take chances? And so, it's contradictory to, I think, the culture. And then I think there does, getting back to the trading in markets and collaboration. I did see a lot of evidence of that, and I hope that we can continue to move in those directions here in California.
Thank you. So, Caitlin's telling me we have to move to Q&A, but I want to give them each 30 seconds to say, while you're thinking of your questions for them, either your top priority for this year or what you saw as something actually really good that happened this past year. Or if you can squeeze both in if you can do it fast. Susan.
Our local top priorities?
You could be your local top priority, sure.
Our local top priorities is to develop local resources. We're halfway through construction of a 35-mile, $200 million brine line, built our ocean outfall to develop 40,000 acre-feet of brackish groundwater. We're doing a lot of turf removal, $3 a square foot, 6 million square feet last year, going to do more this year. Working on public outreach to build those tunnels under the delta, which is essential, and starting to study ocean desal.
Joe.
Our top priority, and something I'm working on personally, is how to manage this transition in groundwater usage, how to balance our basin. That I think is going to be a tremendous challenge for us in the Southern Valley.
I'm going to take the easy route and say implementing the California Water Action Plan, which there's a great, if you haven't seen the budget summary, the 8 pages has a good summary of all the actions we plan to implement this fiscal year.
Okay.
For us, it's helping to get communities moving forward on implementing the groundwater legislation, and then also making investments to help ensure that the bond money's well spent.
I see potential for a lot of synergies here, just want to say. Because to the extent that urbans are able to scale back, that frees up water for somebody else. Mm-hmm. And that's potentially a piece of the groundwater puzzle too. Mm-hmm. With that, Folks are standing at the ready with microphones, so let's take questions for this group.
Last question, I want to actually piggyback on what Mike Anderson talked about earlier in terms of climate change and less snowpack, and the impact that's not having snow up in the mountain has to do with communities. We may have precipitation, but you get places like East Porterville, Martha talked about, that don't have the water. Up in Tuolumne County, city of Montague, Willits, those places, with the lack of snow, even though we have rain, they go dry and they run out of water. How do we deal with that?
Well, I mean, I think what I was mentioning is just this new phenomenon that they haven't had to deal with before, which is they have to have their own storage supply, and they really have not invested in that. You know, I think Willits had a 3 to 6 month supply, and I think what they were asked to do with some of their funding was a 2-year. So I think it's not a new science for that, fortunately, but it is a new practice and investment that they haven't had to make.
I think conjunctive use is a big part of that puzzle for global warming overall. We can't store water in our groundwater basins if they're not well managed, because it's like putting money into a bank and anybody can get the water out, the money out. So this groundwater sustainability legislation is going to make a big difference. And if we can get well-managed basins, we can put that water in basins fairly quickly and have some big reservoirs to call upon. But they've got to be well-managed, and we're decades away from that.
And just as a little data point for you, we were recently looking at the numbers. The capacity of groundwater storage is so much vaster than surface storage, and clearly both of those kinds of storage are really important for our system, but groundwater is the drought reservoir, really.
Right.
Yeah.
No question.
Another question.
Yeah.
Maury.
Thank you. I've got a question or two about the elimination of turf, because what I observe is a small army of rather low-skilled people that go around weekly mowing lawns. So what are they going to do for work? The second aspect, at inland locations, if everybody eliminated the grass, you'd see a rise in summer afternoon temperatures, and it would increase the air conditioning load significantly. So where do you plug that in?
I think that we can get some real benefit with just Mediterranean landscaping. Use sages, use mulches. That's not like having concrete that heats the air up. I think we need to be true to and embrace our Mediterranean climate and make that our landscaping. And those guys will have lots of weeds to pull.
Just a quick observation again from Australia. They really actually were as concerned about heat island effect and deaths from heat waves as they were from drought itself, and actually made fairly concerted investments, not just in water conservation, but ensuring that some of the water is being reserved for the greenscape or for the landscape. Now, turf versus other forms of ground cover, I think that's really where the distinction lies.
I think also community turf might be something different. You know, a park and a soccer field. Those have real purpose and are used by many people. It's the turf in medians and the turf in big green lawns that maybe there aren't kids running around on. Those are the challenges. It's not I'm not an activist to get rid of all turf. It's just let's be smart about it and let's accept that we don't live in England.
One last question. There's the mic there. Start again, please.
Wonder if perhaps you could address how the issue of drip irrigation in the agricultural community is going over. I know there's a factor of cost, but also on cost, why are we not addressing more desalination, which would fall into the category of new water, if at all? I know there's a cost factor, but there are other countries and cities in California that have made the decision to invest there. Why are we not talking more about that?
A couple of questions here. First, on desalinization, certainly we should be looking at it. There's no question about it. In fact, we're doing studies right now. So far, that has not been, at least for the San Joaquin Valley, hasn't been an economic proposition. But we're working right now with some water that's being produced by oil fields in the south end of the valley, which I think actually can be reclaimed and used for agricultural purposes. We're doing some of that now. I think that can be vastly expanded. We are interested in any new water supply that can be brought to bear and used beneficially. There's no doubt about that. You'd be hard-pressed to find an orchard or vineyard in Kern County that is not drip or micro sprinkler irrigated today. I welcome any of you that want to come down and have a look at what we're doing. It's amazing what we're doing with irrigation today. We've done 30 years of research on the most efficient ways to irrigate, and I can guarantee you we are not wasting water, at least down in our end of the valley. I think that 10 years from now, we'll have devices that can apply the exact amount that individual trees within orchards need on a daily basis. I think that's not far off. We're just at the point now where we're going to be able to take imagery of our orchards and measure the individual stress of trees. We have in our orchards about 13.5 million trees. We're going to be able to take daily measurements of the individual stress of those trees and address that. You don't get water conservation any higher level than that. In other words, in terms of water efficiency. So I think we are taking this very seriously in terms of making the best use of the water that we have. No question about that. It's a great question. Thanks.
I think this ties in really well with the point that Jay made, kicking off his sort of looking forward recommendations of the importance of really managing water more tightly going forward, and all of the aspects of measurement and technology that go with that. So with that, I'm going to thank you and ask you all to thank this great panel. Thank Jay. And so we're going to do a super quick mic switch over and panel photo. So Jay, come on up and we'll take a quick photo. You can stand up, but don't go away. Okay?